Okay, well, let's try to get more to the text here. Uh, I like that on page Roman numeral 15, uh, Williams writes, I reflect here upon what it means to take seriously as a primary theological source the faith, thought, and life struggle of African American women. By naming this as a primary theological source, uh, she's she's appealing to a kind of experience, which is fine. Um, in terms of what's sometimes called the Wesleyan quadrilateral scripture, tradition, reason, experience. Turns out those four are very intertwined and inseparable. But she definitely wants to put forward a history of experience of African American women. I am in the throes, she says, of what the ancient African theologian Augustine and the European theologian Anselm termed faith seeking understanding. Very famous phrase in the history of theology. Uh, Later in that paragraph, faith seeking understanding from an oppressed black female's perspective means affirming the necessity of political and spiritual works. She puts the word works in quotation marks, and it's interesting use of the word works. Clearly, she means it in a kind of theological way. Affirming these works for the salvation of oneself and for the salvation of the black family, of the homeless, of the destitute, of the young black people lost in the drug culture in North America. Wow. And then the next paragraph, given what looks like what looks like genocidal impulses in American culture, and we folks that are not black may cringe at those words, but I think they're true. What looks like genocidal impulses in American culture directed toward black people, male and female, what kind of works can stem from black women's belief in a God who helps them make a way out of no way? So we've already said that's going to be an important phrase for her. On page 17, she begins to discuss very particularly womanist theology. There's so much that one could talk about here, but bottom paragraph, she says or writes, like black male liberation theology, and when you hear that phrase, some of you perhaps have read a little bit of James Cone. He's now passed away, but his book, The Cross and the Lynching Tree, which was certainly his last major book, probably his last book, and garnered a lot of attention and is used in some courses here at Point Loma. So he would be the most obvious, though again now no longer living, black male liberation theologian. There are others, and in many ways, our own Dr. Montague Williams is moving toward ascending to a role very much like that, just because of his really great work on M.L. King Jr. But Dolores writes, womanist theology assumes the necessity of responsible freedom for all human beings. But womanist theology especially concerns itself with the faith, survival, and freedom struggle of African American women. Thus, and this is a very important sentence, thus, womanist theology identifies and critiques black male oppression of black females. So in other words, well, you get it. Womanist theology has as one of its burdens to address the fact that not all oppression of black women has come from non-black people, or Caucasian white folks, but often from black men. So, and the fact is that liberation theology, black liberation theology, for the first couple decades, all written by men, or at least pretty much, seem to fall into the same kind of patriarchal patterns and assumptions about sort of male, very, we'll say, male-centric. And so womanist theology is addressing itself to that problem, as well as to the problem of feminist theology, where the concern was, this is all too white. Sometimes these are white women's problems that, and not to delegitimate that, but womanist theology says we have our own history, our own issues, our own struggles that we want to bring to voice. Nonetheless, in fact, she actually starts this next sentence with a nonetheless. This is on page 18, Roman numeral 18. Top paragraph right in the middle. Nonetheless, womanist theology is usually non-separatist and dialogical. It welcomes discourse with a variety of theological voices: liberation, white feminist, mujerista, Latina theology, Jewish, Asian, African, classical and contemporary male stream, and that's in place of mainstream, I guarantee you, as well as non-feminist, non-womanist female voices. So she's saying we want to be in dialogue with a lot of different folks and a lot of different communities. And so then she moves into the introduction. And if you don't know it by now, in this chapter, she really begins to talk about Hagar and the story of Hagar in Genesis that will really provide her the kind of scriptural lens as she tries to read, interpret, and theologize about African American women's history. So the story of Hagar, and she finds many, many connections. A lot of them you can guess already, but if you've read the intro, you don't even have to guess. This is an interesting sentence, and this is that top paragraph on page 5. Thus, it seemed to me that God's response to Hagar's and her child's situation was survival. Now, this response had to do with the first time she ran away, and she's out there, and I don't know if she's given birth yet or not, but I don't think so. And an angel of God tells her to go back, go back to the oppressor, go back and live with Abraham and Sarah. And her point really becomes, this probably was the, the best possible evil, and the necessary evil of for survival, because she wasn't going to survive on her own out in the desert, especially as a pregnant woman. So thus it seemed to me, she writes, that God's response to this situation was survival and involvement in their development of an appropriate quality of life. So she's going to talk a lot about both survival and, quality of life. That is, a quality of life appropriate to their situation and their heritage. I don't know if she had process theology in mind here, but it kind of sounded like it, in the sense that she's saying something like God's response to Hagar is, while it may not seem all that great to us, is like sort of the best possible move for her at that point. That God always works with where we are and who we are and what situation, calling us like in the next step toward the best possible future that present and our past could lead to. So in this case, it's actually back to Abram and Sarah. So later on that page, she says that she's kind of naming her theological angle, the survival/quality of life tradition of African American biblical appropriation. Later in that paragraph, which is second to the last one on page 5, in Black consciousness, God's response of survival and quality of life to Hagar is God's response of survival and quality of life to African American women and mothers of slave descent struggling to sustain their families with God's help. Of course, we should remember, and she talks about it in this introduction, that Hagar herself was a slave. as I think about what we've done with theodicy so far, I on page 6, Williams writes right under a long quotation from a church historian, black scholar named Gayroud Wilmore. She writes, the slave's effort to create an alternative value system, alternative to their slave owners, represents a struggle to achieve a positive quality of life. With their syncretized African American religion, that is syncretized by elements of African traditional religions, they believe, syncretized with Christianity, I should say, they believed in God's presence with them. This belief, connecting with the survival quality of life struggle, gave hope to the slaves' daily lives of oppression and toil. So it's the beginning of a theodicy. It may not be a complete one, and we might hope for more, but God's presence with these human beings who suffered so deeply. What kind of theodicy might this move us toward? God's presence with them could potentially lead us to a kind of open model where, it is not God's will, it's not God's desire that some human beings should treat others as slaves, even though we have slavery, in the story of Abraham and Sarah. But that God cannot, or at least refuses to control human agency and human misuse of power. It actually also, in many ways, could connect to a process theology. We'll have to look for whether Dolores Williams ever leans in that direction, in the sense that in her other line, she's talked about God basically working with Hagar in her situation to bring about potentially the best possible next step. And that certainly includes God's presence with the person as they encounter new situations in life, which happen to us every second, and process theology is all about that. And in some ways then similar to open theology. I think I've mentioned that in class. So we'll see how it comes out. Now, I'm going to pause here so this isn't getting longer, and then I'm going to come back for one more brief clip.